Okay, welcome to the 48th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm excited to be speaking to Matthew Green. Matthew is a former Reuters climate and Financial Times correspondent and has reported from more than 30 countries. He is now global investigations editor at DeSmog, a non-profit climate news service. He is also a co-host of the Collective Trauma Summit 2022 and a student on Thomas Hübl's 2-year Timeless Wisdom training program. He writes the Resonant World newsletter on healing collective trauma. He is also the author of the book Aftershock, the Untold Story of Surviving Peace. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks, Piers. It's great to be here, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. We've only just connected, but it was very synchronistic to hear about your work with men, with boarding school survivors, and I think we have a lot of shared interests. So very much looking forward to diving in.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, big thank you to Kevin Alban as well, who sent me your article. And when I read it, it was like, I just could hardly breathe for a few days. It's like, this guy's got it. And it's like, oh my God, it's like, so I was really excited. And I was like, when you said,
This was the article about what the climate movement can learn from processes to heal collective trauma.
Exactly.
That I wrote for DeSmog. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll put that into the description so people can look at that. And I love for all my guests to just begin sharing a bit of how you got into the work you now do today. You can be as long or as short.
Well, I started out as a classical foreign correspondent, working in East and West Africa. I worked in Iraq. I was embedded with US Marines during the invasion in 2003, joined the Financial Times, worked in West Africa and Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I had a long period where I was very much covering international news. And then I took a kind of handbrake turn. I had an opportunity to write a book about soldiers and their families struggling to overcome the psychological wounds of war. So I moved back home and I spent a year traveling around meeting veterans and understanding more about their struggles and the kinds of therapies that were helping them. And that became my book, Aftershock. And it very much opened me up to a much deeper understanding of trauma. I'd suffered depression in my own life. So I'd already embarked on I suppose you might call it a healing journey of my own. And having the opportunity to hear these soldiers' stories was a kind of way for me, in some ways, to explore myself, even though I didn't write about that explicitly in the book. And that period really opened me up to a much broader understanding of trauma, how it affects individuals, but also increasingly how it affects society as a whole. And my current work is very much focused on studying, as you mentioned, with Thomas Hübl, the Austrian facilitator, teacher, and author, who takes large group processes to heal collective trauma, which I think is a really exciting frontier to explore as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was listening to Thomas on the Collective Trauma Summit, and I had heard of him. I think I'd been receiving emails from, I've forgotten who it is. And I was like, who's this Thomas? So when I heard in your article, I was like,
yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because I spent a lot of time studying trauma and spirituality and inner work, but it was only a few years ago that I came across Thomas Hübl's work through a friend of mine who appeared on the first Collective Trauma Summit he convened back in 2019. And it was only through making that personal connection that I really felt this real deep connection with his work. And since then, I've become more and more involved in supporting it and studying it. And I really think he is one of the leading edge practitioners, but also playing this really vital role in convening allies and organizations globally to start to build this global healing movement.
So it kind of segues into what is the Collective trauma healing, and how did it start, and what's it about?
Well, I suppose I can answer this best through my own experience and my own understanding. And there's probably other people who could articulate this much more thoroughly and accurately. So this is going to be my slightly idiosyncratic version.
Perfect.
But as I mentioned, I'd written this book, Aftershock, about veterans and their struggles with trauma. And it was very much focused on individuals' healing journey, understanding how they'd suffered trauma, the impact of that, and then really thinking about healing as working mostly one-on-one with a therapist of some kind. And I was very interested in different modalities. You know, a lot of the therapy that's offered in the UK is basically cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, which is very much focused on the thoughts and the mind. And that can have benefits for some people. But to me, it's very much the very first level of what a real healing journey looks like, you know, and the book is arguing that we need to really get down into the body, understand that trauma lives inside our nervous system, and that to release it is usually going to take a lot more than talking. So that was the kind of start of that was sort of where I arrived at by the end of writing Aftershock. But as I've gone forward, I've recognized that there's a lot more to trauma than simply what we're carrying as individuals. And even our concept of who we are can be challenged as we understand more about the healing process. So in the work with Thomas Hubl, we talk about three levels: individual, ancestral, and collective trauma. So individual is more or less what happened to you during your lifetime, you know, whether it was childhood neglect or war or domestic violence or all the other forms that traumatic experiences can take. At the ancestral level is recognizing that we're born into lineages and family systems where our parents, our grandparents, and other forebears can also carry trauma and can pass that on to us. And that is something that is quite well elaborated in the practice of many therapists, but it's still, I don't think, a concept that has really pierced popular understanding in any way. And it certainly was outside the scope of my research on my book, even though I've had experiences since then where I've really got in touch with my own ancestral war trauma from my grandfather, my great uncle, and perhaps others further back. So that's become very alive in my experience since that book was written. And I suppose the ancestral level is the stepping stone to the collective level, where we recognize that traumatic events in history, war, slavery, genocide, colonialism, even economic collapse or poverty, all of these traumatic experiences that affect large groups or communities of people also live on and replicate and perpetuate themselves unless they're brought to the surface and addressed and resolved, just in the same way that an individual can carry a trauma symptom if they don't find the right support to heal it. So can a whole society act out dysfunctional patterns and repeating behaviors. And I've found that to be such a fascinating lens to apply to understand why we have so many seemingly intractable problems in society and also on a global level. And that's why I think this collective trauma work is of such planetary consequence, because it not only provides a frame for us to understand what's going wrong more clearly, it also provides protocols and processes that we can use. And I'm not sure how I feel about this term at scale, but in a way it is taking healing to scale. And looking at the news every night, it's pretty clear that we need to be rolling out healing at scale as fast as we possibly can.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking, because I didn't quite understand those three levels. I have heard of, obviously in my work, the individual, then there's also the ancestral, you know, but the collective, yeah, that's really fascinating to hear that.
To give that a little more context, Thomas Hubl started his work with groups of Holocaust survivors and their children. I believe in Israel. He also works a lot in Germany. And he would lead them on like hundreds of people at a time through a 4-day process that he elaborated over time, which would allow this community of people who had a shared experience to come together to support one another, to allow the traumatic material to rise safely to the surface and be resolved. And the power of the group, and we talk about group coherence, collective intelligence, concepts that we can unpack more, but which are really core to this collective healing work, really allow an accelerated healing process than would perhaps be possible working one-on-one. Sometimes Thomas uses the analogy of parallel processors in a computer circuit. We can have one processor working away, but when we chain or link all these processors together, we can have an exponential increase in computing power. And it's a similar process with group healing. When we come together in a group, we can heal exponentially faster than we could doing it one by one. So that's the kind of, and then from that route, this approach has been used with other communities, communities in the US who have been subject to racial injustice, or refugee communities, migrant communities, communities in Argentina who have a shared experience of political oppression. It obviously helps if the group has a kind of certain level of shared experience to build on. That can really, really be supportive of the process. But actually, the work we're doing in the Timeless Wisdom training is, in a sense, collective trauma healing. And we come from quite diverse, different backgrounds, but it also works in that context as well.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. Yeah, it kind of makes me reflect that last year I was involved in this festival called Menfest, which is down in Devon. It's about 150 to 200 men. And we did a circle, a boarding school survivors circle. And there was 20 men in that. And for me, that was so cathartic, because I've done Men's Circle online, but we only had 3 minutes each to share. And I think I was the third or fourth person to share. And I just shared my story in 3 minutes. I was in tears. And as we went around the circle, it felt so healing. And I can really attest to that. People speaking up, things they'd never spoken up about before. And so, yeah, that's, yeah, thank you. That's really put that into context. So thank you. So I think the next thing I'd love to just connect in, just to begin this, is about climate change. Obviously, that's your passion now. Would you be able to speak a little bit about that? What drew you from doing your work with Reuters, with Financial Times, into, right, this is where I'm needed?
Well, it's a good question. And again, there was an element of serendipity involved. After I published Aftershock, I spent a couple of years writing, speaking on these topics. And then I had a daughter and I needed to get a job. So I phoned up some editors who I'd worked for, hoping they'd remember me. And fortunately, an editor at Reuters had commissioned a big project on the impact of climate change on oceans and marine life and ocean communities around the world. And he asked me if I could join that and be part of that. So that was a 9-month project. I traveled to West Africa, Borneo, Norway, and worked with colleagues around the world. And that officially brought me into the climate journalism world. I'd always been very concerned about climate change and the environment more broadly. This really was a moment where I was able to work professionally on the subject. And there's another important piece of this, because there was a period after that project was finished and before I started officially as climate correspondent at Reuters, which I did for another couple of years, and where I wrote an article about Extinction Rebellion for the Financial Times magazine. And I was fascinated by Extinction Rebellion, partly because the movement was actually grappling with the inner and psychological dimensions of the climate crisis, even the spiritual dimensions, specifically acknowledging the role of grief, of our own sense of moral injury, or the many ways that being alive at this moment in human history is a huge challenge, but also demands a response. And that, to me, was a very compelling conversation, which also touches on the collective trauma work. My thinking has been really influenced by my experiences with and conversations with some of the leaders in that movement as well. So that was quite a formative moment for me. I was never a participant in Extinction Rebellion, but I did get to know the movement as a journalist really quite well. I left Reuters earlier this year. I was hitting walls in terms of what I felt was possible in terms of coverage. And now I work at DeSmog, which is a non-profit climate investigations news service, where I'm coordinating investigations around the world. But really, I suppose I see my bigger mission as trying to really braid together what I've learned about trauma healing on those three levels: individual, ancestral, and collective, with the question of how do we respond to the climate and ecological emergency? What can we draw from that understanding of trauma that might inform a more effective global response?
Thank you. Great, wonderful mission.
Yes, well, yeah, a slightly daunting one, but amazing to be able to publish and talk about this now. It's a conversation that is long overdue, but it feels like the moment is very ripe for it. There's a lot of interest in it, a lot of appetite and acknowledgement that we need to dig deeper as a species if we're going to make the changes that we need to make.
Yeah. And in preparation for today, I was just reading through some notes I've made from Nick's book, and I was like, and it's kind of almost
this is Wounded Leaders.
Yeah, where did I put it? Somewhere.
on the impact of boarding school on our political elites.
Yeah.
Great book.
So that one.
Fantastic.
And I was just reading in there today just to prepare this morning, and it was like trying to almost connect the dots between the climate, the earth, and also the trauma. And I just was reading this and I was like, I need to speak this. And Nick says, page 212, he says the implications are that the role of mothers in the top half of British society has been undermined, broken, or murdered, and this now continues from within the mother herself. Mothers in Britain, therefore, have lost their confidence in mollifying their rational, non-emotional society. Now, why I thought that was interesting is that, almost like you've mentioned, individual, ancestral, collective, could the mother, on a greater sense, be the mother that's Mother Earth? So actually, the top half of British society has got that mother wound, and it's being reflected. And then speaking to Nick a few weeks ago in London, he says, I've just received this email saying that 52 out of 92 of the current global leaders, and again, I'm not entirely sure because he didn't specify, went to English boarding school.
That's amazing, isn't it?
And it's like,
it's incredible.
Oh my God. So that just came to me. So yeah, I'd love you to speak to what you also read in Nick's work.
Yes, well, this is a huge question. And I think it can become quite abstract as well, which is important because we do need to think about this on a global and archetypal, transpersonal level to really ask ourselves, where have we gone wrong as a species? How can it be that we are so busily dismantling our life support system and making only quite perfunctory efforts to do anything about that. I mean, it is an extraordinary moment that we're in when you look at what the science says about where we are and where we're headed if we don't change course, and the enormous resistance to changing course. So clearly that is a reflection of some deep dysfunction in the human psyche, some imbalance, some disconnection that has allowed us collectively to arrive at this impasse. And I believe it's also this impasse which is going to be the catalyst for a big accelerating shift. And in that sense, I do believe that change is happening. I think this question of the mother wound is really fascinating, and it really stretches the edge of my own awareness and understanding to even really begin to articulate these concepts. And so I'm really appreciating the space between us now as you allow me to kind of dive in, almost not sure where I'm going to end up speaking about this. But it feels like, as I wrote in the article for DeSmog about climate change and collective trauma, and after the work of Ian McGilchrist and others, this idea that we have these different modes of consciousness, the quotes, left brain, calculating, rational, dominating, separation mindset, and then the right brain, and acknowledging that the brain and the hemispheres are more complex than that, but nonetheless, as shorthand, the right brain, the more intuitive, interconnected, holistic way of seeing reality. And it doesn't seem like a great stretch to accept that that left brain way of thinking has become so predominant that it is allowing us to engage in these behaviors, which are essentially going to destroy us if we don't return to some kind of balance. Now, I'm always wary of romanticizing some prelapsarian past where we were all living in harmony with nature and everything was perfect. I'm skeptical about that. I'm sure that there's always been rough and smooth in the human experience. Nevertheless, just looking at where we are in recent decades, in the last few decades, how much in my lifetime, how much damage has been done. Something has clearly gone very wrong. And understanding the roots of that internally seem to me as much as important as tinkering policies and reforms in the system, because unless we have that deeper shift, then we're going to keep recreating the same conditions, which is why I think the kind of work Nick has done with his book Wounded Leaders, to really join the dots, to write a psychohistory, to offer an explanation of why the British elite, and by extension so much of imperial and colonial history, has been so destructive and dysfunctional and oppressive, and how we're still processing that today. We're still living in the boarding school. We're all living in the boarding school because that's how power has been organized. And he's really drawn the veil back on that. And to me, it's a textbook. I don't think I've even heard the term collective trauma in the book, but it's almost a textbook example of what collective trauma, why it's such a systemic issue, and why it's so invisibilized. In Thomas Hübl's work, we talk about absencing. It's absenced. It's not, nobody talks about the fact that our leaders are damaged systematically by this practice and the impact of that, apart from Nick and us, a few people. But really, that should be kind of a continuous discussion and front page news, right? If we really want to understand what's gone wrong, really understand. So I was blown away by the book, like you, and I think we should have many more books that take that approach to try to understand why we've ended up where we are and where we can go next, and what are the practices we can adopt to get there.
Thank you. I mean, for me as well, it's like it just blew my mind. And then when I read your article, I'm like, oh my god, that's incredible. And part of the questions I just took little quotations from your talk, from your article, because I was like, because when I was reading them, I'm like, oh.
It's quite rare that my articles have this much impact on anyone, but I'm delighted to hear that it lit something up in you. That's exactly the idea, If you hear, if you have the ears to hear, you can think, wow, like there's something really. I feel like I don't know. I'm always struggling to know how to convey this work, but it feels so powerful and potent and ready for me to be propagated more broadly, that it's really exciting to hear somebody respond in the way that you are. It really energizes me to do more of it.
Yeah, thank you. It's like during lockdowns, and then since then, whenever I talk to people who haven't been to boarding school, and just telling them about the leaders, everyone's like, oh my God, I never thought about that. Like you say about absencing, Nick talks about it normalizing. We've just normalized it. They're just like that. It's like,
well,
yeah.
As I was reading it, I mean, I didn't go to boarding school, but when I was a correspondent, let's put it this way: I went to a good boys' school, not a boarding school. Wasn't one of the top ones, but it was a decent school, a private school. I went to Oxford, and I was in the milieu of that upper echelon who were educated at the really top public schools and boarding schools. And when I was a correspondent, there were more people from that milieu as well, whether they were journalists or in the diplomatic service. So although I haven't been through that route, I have friends who certainly have been through that route. And I feel I should offer the caveat that I'm not now making assumptions about their experience, because every experience is unique, and it's important not to categorize or label people or kind of assume we know more than we do. So I'm adding that big caveat in all this conversation. But nevertheless, the case that Nick makes is so compelling that I feel it deserves to be heard. And also, I remember I was thinking of one particular experience I had when I was a correspondent for the Financial Times. And it was a press trip that David Cameron was making to Afghanistan, which I tagged along on. And obviously David Cameron, boarding school. And the journalists who were accompanying him to Afghanistan were the lobby correspondents, right? They're the journalists who cover Westminster. Many of them probably went to boarding school. And I joined this kind of caravan in, I think, was it in Abu Dhabi or en route to Helmand province. So I was kind of embedded within this existing press corps that I actually have very little in common with, actually, because the kind of work we're doing is very, very different. Being a correspondent in Kabul or Islamabad versus covering the ding dong of Westminster. So I actually kind of had some shadow of superiority towards them anyway, because I thought I'm doing real journalism. I don't really think that now, but anyway, I probably at the time was a little bit arrogant towards them. But I remember joining this kind of contingent, and it was like being at certainly, I've not been at a boarding school, but it was certainly like a public school environment. Almost all men in the press corps, all kind of like all copying, almost leaning each over and checking each other's answers, like on their stories, like, are we saying the same thing? Copying each other's homework. And obviously just enthralled to power, following around the big man, the prime minister, who's head boy in a sense. And the other part of it, which was so striking, was that there were a couple, I think it was one or two, certainly women press officers who were the mediators between Cameron and this kind of pack. And occasionally they would just appear, and everyone, all the men, the boys would gather round waiting, and they would hand out quotes or little tidbits of information that almost like giving out a spoonful of sugar, to the boys who would all eagerly write them down, then go back to their computers and copy them. And the whole thing felt so archaic and institutionalized and frankly uncomfortable. And then I thought back and then I met Cameron briefly, and I got his whole shtick, the puffed up Etonian confidence and just bullshit basically. And then as I was reading Nick's book, that incident, that experience came back to me, and I thought, wow, like this is exactly what he's talking about. You know, these people are not. We're not. This isn't the system we need to be finding the truth and holding leaders accountable and informing citizens. This is just something else. It's a sort of self-referential, self-serving bubble. And that's why I think there is partly why there's such a disconnect between Westminster and the rest of the country. It's the media is as much captured by that. I think there's a lot of the boarding school trauma that plays out through the media that is supposedly holding this system to account as much as in the actual system. So it bleeds across and through, and it's all one system. So I love the book, and it made me think of some personalities that I've come across in my time and go, okay, that explains a lot. Okay.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that story about David Cameron, because I think that's how Nick's book begins.
Yes, with the calm down dear incident. Yes, exactly. Yes, but it was the entourage that felt very much on a similar frequency. It felt like it was all of a piece. Yeah. That no one's going to notice that this is not quite right, you know. So yeah, I loved. I mean, there's many other elements of the book as well that rang true, but that particular incident I found very telling.
Yeah, interesting. Robert Vercake, in his book, I had him on the podcast about 3 episodes ago.
Oh, okay. Yes.
He talks about, he quotes, 50 out of 100 of the top journalists in the UK were, he says, private, possibly boarding school. And I think Rupert Murdoch, he was at Geelong Grammar School, which is a boarding school in Australia. I think Prince Charles possibly went there for a year while he was at when he was at school. So yeah, it's interesting how it's not just, and I spoke to a professor, Petter Sandgren, in my last podcast, and he was saying that in, say, Sweden, it's just the, say, business or the aristocracy who go to boarding school. And he says the same in America, it's mainly just commerce or, you know, people in business. But in this country, he says it's across all areas, media, it's in, you know, law,
finance,
government,
diplomacy. Yeah.
It's in every
military. Yeah.
Military as well. And I found, okay, fascinating. So, time will go. It's already 22. I could talk to you for ages. So one of the things I would love to speak about, what else? I mean, we've spoken a bit about that. One of your quotes was, the industrialized world's failure to mount a meaningful response to climate change is itself a symptom of collective trauma rooted in patterns of exploitation handed down over generations. Is there anything you want to add to that?
That was a big statement I made there. I'm just trying to think, what did it mean? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's a question of, I mean, we just have to draw back historical perspective a few hundred years. You know, it's not long ago that Britain and other European nations were sailing around the world, setting up colonies, extracting resources, enslaving the inhabitants. So clearly that was okay, right? There was a consensus at one point that was the right thing to be doing. And as Nick points out in the book, there was all kinds of psychological defense mechanisms that we used to compartmentalize that behavior, justify it, rationalize it. We use the church, we're helping these poor benighted people to find God. All kinds of self-serving justifications were used to essentially justify this pattern of exploitation that was incredibly stark in the colonial period, but has now morphed into something different, in that, yes, we now have countries that become independent, and on the surface, at least, we're living in a more equitable world. But the way trade relations work, the way corporations operate, the way the rules are written, still lock in place a system that is privileging industrialized countries in the West, which obviously are responsible for the great bulk of historical emissions, UK, US, which are now causing the problem, which is impacting the world's most poorest countries, or the poorest countries. So that injustice is, to my mind, and I think many people's have observed this, it's a direct reflection of the same injustice, the same kind of injustice that we were visiting on many communities around the world a few hundred years ago through the imperial project. So I remember once I was interviewing Patricia Espinosa, who was a former Mexican foreign minister who ran the UN climate change body, UNFCCC, and I was interviewing her at a Reuters event a few years ago, and we touched on this issue of environmental justice, and I'd read this somewhere, and I flipped it around, and I said, imagine what the world's response would be if, instead of carbon dioxide emissions causing the world to heat up, imagine they actually caused the world to cool down. And we were already seeing glaciers advancing across northern Europe towards Paris and London at accelerating speed. Do we think the response that the world has shown to the climate crisis would be different? And I suspect it rather would be, in that when you think about what is available to us in terms of a response, even simple things like energy efficiency, insulating homes, designing our products, even our cities, our working lives to reduce energy. There's so many fairly simple, painless steps that we could take to make a much more credible response to the emergency. But we're not doing it. What is it? What's wrong with us? And it's partly because the people who are suffering are black and brown people in sacrifice zones in the global south. Actually, it's not the people sitting in the industrialized north who are feeling the worst impacts. That's changing, but how can it be that we allow that if it isn't some kind of compartmentalization, distancing, othering of the people who are on the sharp end of this? And that, to me, is a direct straight line from colonialism, imperialism. And we know the boarding school system from Nick was the kind of incubator, engine, and replicator of that whole process, psychologically conditioning the agents of empire and providing this institutional, these values, this consistency that has kept that mindset, has inculcated that mindset up to this very present day. So it all connects. I feel that's why I was also very compelled by what he wrote, because it seemed to kind of, it just gave this, it connected these dots in a way that I hadn't seen connected before. It unveiled one of the central mechanisms through how this system perpetuated itself and still perpetuates itself. So amazing.
Yeah. So people, if you're listening to this podcast, you're like, why do they keep talking about Nick? Go and buy his book. It's incredible. It is. It's interesting.
It is a great book. Yeah.
When I saw him in London a few weeks ago, I was like, oh, I love your book. And I was showing him, in preparation for the interview, I did 28 pages of notes. And
wow.
Because it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. Write it all down. And he was saying, yeah, very few people have really got on board with his book. And I'm like, it's like you say, it's the missing piece here.
Yeah.
We've got, this problem with the environment. We've got problem with cost of living. And as he says, if we have learned, as I learned at school, and if you listen to Prince Charles talking about I think it's his first year, either at Gordonstoun or his other prep school, that they basically just gave him bread and water or something like that, whether it was the first week, I forget. So it's almost like the first years at school, we're treated terribly. And therefore we suppress in that vulnerable part. And then because of that we treat that part of ourselves terribly. When we get older, we then treat those who are poor, vulnerable, terribly. And he says that as one of the points why we don't make, as exporters, good leaders until we heal. So when I spoke to him a month ago in London, he's like talking about this importance of the heart, which he mentions at the end in his conclusion in the book. So I'd love you to segue into, maybe, because we've got about 10 minutes to go, about some of the solutions, collective trauma healing, what your vision might be. Yeah.
That's a wonderful question. Let me take a few moments just to see what wants to come forward. We have the tools now. We have the tools. This is the amazing part for me about this time in history, is that just as we're heading towards total meltdown, I do believe that there is a rising awareness or consciousness that is emerging all around the world, which is moving us towards a greater understanding and awareness of these dysfunctional patterns that we host within us and that have been implanted into us, conditioned into us, and which can run our lives until we wake up and start to unpack, dismantle, dissolve, and resolve them. So that's the process at a larger level. And what do we do more practically? I am a great believer in the group process. I think one-on-one therapy can be really important. Sometimes it's the right thing for specific individuals, but I think we need to rethink mental health. And even the concept of mental health has lots of limitations, but let's just use it as a placeholder for now. Even in my own experience, until a few years ago, my model of healing was very much a one-on-one process. And I thought the answer was, what's the right modality? Talk therapy is inadequate, usually, to get to the roots. How do we go deeper? And I write in Aftershock about more spiritually informed processes, embodied processes, somatic processes. I'm a great believer in the judicious, skilled use of psychedelic assisted therapy. I think that can be extremely powerful if it's done in the right kind of container, with the right integration, preparation, follow-up, and so on. So we have, but that was still thinking about therapy as basically a one-on-one enterprise. But where I'm coming to now through the Thomas Hubl work is recognizing that these group processes can be catalysts for much rapider, deeper, more profound transformation. And I believe that we are going to see them proliferate much more in the future. If you think back 20, 30 years even, yoga would have been seen as an incredibly esoteric, far out kind of practice. And now there's a yoga studio virtually on every high street, or it's commonplace. Same with mindfulness, meditation. These, and we can raise questions about how these practices are co-opted or how they're applied, and the political economy of New Age, and there's a whole basket of issues that we could delve into. But nevertheless, fundamentally, these are practices about building awareness, which have become mainstream. And similarly, breath work. I don't know if you follow breath work much, but I remember going to visit someone in Canada a few years ago. This is 5, 6 years ago, who was very into self-development and personal growth. And he was saying to me then, you know what hasn't gone big yet? We've got yoga, we've got meditation, breath work. It's so powerful. It's such a powerful practice, but where do you do it? How's it been packaged? Someone should do that. And now it's out there. There's books on it. There's Wim Hof. I follow Soma Breath with Niraj Naik. It's now come, it's arrived, just as he predicted it could do, right? So we're seeing these waves, psychedelic renaissance. Psychedelics are now becoming very mainstream. The next wave, I think, is understanding that the healing journey is fundamentally a group endeavor. It has to be done in community to be effective. We'll look back on 100 years since Freud and think, what have we been doing all this time? We thought we were supposed to be visiting a therapist once a week. No, we need to be in the right group space. because not only do we heal quicker, our process is in resonance with the processes of others in the group, helping them, creating a group energy which is incredibly powerful, and then can link up with other groups and really start to appreciably shift the level of consciousness globally. So that for me is the frontier, and that's why I was so delighted to be a co-host of the Collective Trauma Summit this year. I kind of, as I said to Thomas, a sort of battlefield promotion. He just asked me to get involved in it. I hadn't expected to be part of it, but I played a role and I was delighted. I'm going back to Germany in a couple of weeks in November for his next level of training. And we're seeing enormous interest. I don't know how many people tuned into that summit this year, but last year it was more than 100,000 viewers. And I'm sure it will grow again. So people are waking up to this possibility. So we just need to assemble this, what Thomas calls his global healing architecture. We have the blueprints, we have the tools, we have the techniques. We just need to start using them more diligently and ambitiously.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great vision. I love that. Yeah, and it's very similar to me. It's like, as I probably shared in an email, I've started to, with a couple of others from the Mankind Project and Band of Brothers, to do a film about boarding school and how that in fact impacts our leaders and therefore the world. And the final part is the gold. How do we transform this trauma into gold? Because I feel a lot of people come to therapy and they're, especially as you've read in the book, we go, I'm fine, because that's part of the strategic survival personality.
Yes.
You know, it's Tony Blair. Nope.
Yeah, exactly.
I've no mistake. I've not made any mistake. And that's classic.
Yeah.
So really feel that if we can see that this trauma or this challenge can be seen as gold, and they, as Kevin Albin said on podcast, saying if they can be the heroes, see themselves as the heroes of the present moment.
Exactly, because this is the other part of, or one of the other big parts of what we need. I think you really hit on something very vital here. Is we need to rethink mental health, and the paradigm we have at the moment is, I bluntly put, you have depression, anxiety, trauma, whatever symptom, there's something wrong with you. Go to this therapist who will help you change the way you think, and you'll come back normal again, and you can carry on back on your treadmill of existence and keep serving the system. Great, that's it. But that's not what it is. What it actually is these symptoms are your deeper soul or your core calling out, showing you that there's an imbalance, there's a healing that needs to take place, there's a transformation that needs to happen, and that they're calling your attention, these symptoms, and you need to transform. And then by doing that, that is where you find the gold. That's the alchemy, that you turn the lead into gold and you become enriched, more aware, wiser, more compassionate, more skillful in whatever way is unique to your path. And that's the narrative that we kind of don't have certainly in the UK. Like, otherwise, when people come, and people do come to me, especially from the media, because they know that I'm engaged in this kind of work, and sometimes people who are struggling want to talk to me, and my first response is wonderful, like, great that you're having a breakdown, brilliant, because you had to break down, because you were totally, you're conditioned, like you would say, Nick would say, strategic survival personality is causing mayhem and needs to be cracked open. And yes, I acknowledge it's very painful in the short term, but this is the midwifery that we need to perform to actually have these rebirths and reemergences for people who are then much more whole and happy and able to pursue or to embody the values that we need at this time, and stop giving their power away to institutions of any sort. Because if you could think about, I mean, just coming to me as we're talking, like, one of the great trauma symptoms of boarding school is you give your power to the institution. What, apart from a concentration camp or a prison, what institution is more total than a boarding school. You're sending a child, defenseless child, into a total institution. Locus of control shift, avoiding, as Nick says in the book, instead of internalizing, this is wrong, what am I doing here, what have my parents done, like it's too much. It's too much of cognitive dissonance for the child to comprehend that this is actually a form of abuse. So they give all their power to the institution. And what do we see now? I mean, look at how supine we are in the face of our institutions. You know, we're having our rights to protest stripped away by the government. We're expecting the NHS to heal us of our psychological maladies instead of coming together in groups to help each other, to tap into collective intelligence. You know, we're kind of all mixed up in our relationship to institutions. And I think that is another symptom of the boarding school syndrome that's percolated through the whole society. So I'm going to stop there.
Beautiful. Yeah, wow. I hadn't really thought of that, but yeah, that kind of makes so much sense, because you know, Nick does talk about that total institution. It's like, yeah.
I mean, you know, we need institutions. You know, I love the NHS. I love living in a society that has functioning, healthy institutions, but they can only be functioning and healthy if we're in right relationship with them, where we're not afraid to leave them when they're not serving us, when we're not afraid to build our own institutions. We're not afraid to update our institutions, rather than seeing them as kind of ossified, authoritarian, parental structures. I see this, I'm going to just share something. I see this, it's really interesting. I've been involved in a lot of conversations around mental health in the workplace, in the media, because the media recognizes, I mean, any employer of any number of people is recognizing that most people are on the edge of burnout and breakdown just as a result of living in 2022. So, you know, often grudgingly, the people at the top of these systems are recognizing they need to do more. Sometimes there are people in these systems as well who are genuinely passionate to help others. But I think that's great and it's really important, but it's also really important that individuals in these institutions recognize that the institution is not going to take care of them. It's not there to fix them or heal them. It will never do that. And it may be that the most healing thing one can do is to leave the institution. So this is the kind of edge that I'm playing with when it comes to this relationship we have to our institutions. And I really think there's a lot more to elaborate about how that boarding school syndrome has colored that nationally in the UK and globally. Yeah. Why do we give up? You know, it would make sense that we give our power away to institutions if we had our power ripped from us at the age of, you know, us as being the collective psyche, you know, at the age of 7. It's nuts, isn't it, really, when you think about it? It's like, what? It's just insane. No wonder we've got all these problems, but thank God that we're now able to sort of shake ourselves awake and go, whoa, like, what's going on? You know?
Yeah, and it's people like yourself having the voices to go, whoa, look at this, you know, because I was speaking to a friend about this and he says, oh, I'm not sure about that. And then, you know, I saw your article and he's like, yeah, he's got it. So yeah, and I'm aware we're at 3 o'clock. So
wow, we're heading to time. Well, we could keep going for another hour, but it's been a real pleasure, Piers, to have this space. It's actually, you've created a space that's helped me to express more of what's coming through for me and really help to make some more connections. And I think that's really valuable. I feel like this is the kind of space we need more of, one-on-one, in groups. I can feel in my body an aliveness or an awakeness that tells me that we are on the track towards deeper understanding. And it's even more exciting to me that other people will be able to hopefully draw on this, take some nourishment and share in this exploration, which is obviously so important if we're going to turn around the trend lines that are not heading in the right direction at the right time right now. So thank you for all the work you do and the men's work you're doing, the work with survivors. It's such an important mission, and it really touches me that you're there to extend that care, that witnessing presence, which is exactly the balm that will help these men turn their lead into gold. So thank you for all you do as well.
Thank you, an honor. And it's exciting hearing you speak. And I say this to all my guests, if I can support your work in any way, I mean, I'd love to organize groups. I thought of that before, doing a boarding school survivors group or something like that around the UK, where people can have a bit like what Desmond Tutu did after the apartheid.
Yeah,
Went
truth and
round to
reconciliation.
yeah.
Yeah.
They,
Well, this is what Thomas Hubl would say about collective trauma healing work, is that it can lead to an ethical restoration. That's actually a big part of the process. There's something we do, and what that looks like can take on so many different forms. But you're right that the fact that I love the analogy. There is an ethical restoration, some kind of public accounting, which doesn't have to be about blame and shame, but it can be an acknowledgement of the trauma and a way to help others to heal, and also to spark conversations about other collective trauma fields. Boarding school is one of them, but there's many others, and this conversation can inform other conversations in other domains.
Yeah. So if I can support in any way, please.
Thank you. Likewise.
So for those who would like to read more of Matthew's work, there is your website, which I'll put in the description, MatthewGreenJournalism.com.
Yeah. And please subscribe to the Resonant World newsletter on Substack. That's where I'm really focusing my work on this topic, and it's
Resonant World.
Weekly updates. It's free, and I'm always looking for ideas, and I'll be writing a newsletter based on this conversation. So
great. Well, thank you so much, and yeah, please do go and buy Matthew's book, and please do go and join up to the Resonant World on Substack, and I'll put a link in the bottom for that.
Thank you, Piers.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye. Oh, I was going to end it for all. No, I'm just going to
at least